It's Christmas Eve, and I'm excited to bring you this episode about the Feast of the Seven Fishes, which is definitely something that comes from the Italian American experience. I grew up with it, but also I kind of didn't. My grandmother would cook an amazing fish feast every Christmas Eve. It was my favorite meal of the year, and those dinners are honestly some of the best memories of my entire life. But there was never a requirement that we have seven. That's not something I heard about until much later. And so, like an Italian American, Carrie Bradshaw, I couldn't help but wonder, where did the Feast of the Seven Fishes come from? I'd like you to meet my good friend, Patrick O'Boyle. He's the co-host of the Italian American podcast and a living, walking Italian American Wikipedia.
This is the theory that I've come up with. Back when TV was the dominant media, I guess it was on one of the New York, because I'm in the New York television area. They had a story on the Feast of the Seven Fishes. Now, everybody knew that Italian people ate fish. That was the tradition on Christmas Eve, right? But we had never heard of this seven fishes.
And this
So
is
I
in
looked,
the 80s, the 1980s?
yeah, it's definitely the 80s.
Okay.
So I remember my mother, my grandmother, and I watching this TV show, a local news show talking about seven fishes. And we looked at each other and said, why seven? It had never, there was no, we had no knowledge or recognition of the seven number. And my grandmother, because being Neapolitan, there's always people from Campania are very, very superstitious. I remember us having a conversation saying, should we have seven fishes? Is it unlucky if we don't? So there must have been something in that news show that said that seven was the lucky number for the fishes, and that's why, and people say it's from sacraments and stuff like that, but there had to be some kind of allusion to seven, it's good luck to have these seven fishes on Christmas Eve, or the Italians eat this and it means a prosperous year. There is, everyone I speak to, there was no communal recognition of this seven fishes as a title until within the last 30 years. Tell me in 1964, 1965, 1955. No one can tell me in 1932 they were cooking seven fishes. It is definitely a 1980s phenomenon. And I know that, John Viola, my co-host, had went through newspapers.com. There's no mention of this whole seven fishes things. I think maybe the first on the newspapers in the late 80s, early 90s. Number one, there's very few things that everyone in Italy does. Right?
Right.
I don't know. Maybe brush their teeth, have a cup of coffee. It's a country that's extremely, as you know, regionally varied. So even if there was a tradition, something so specific as seven fishes, nowhere would that be something all throughout all of Italy. We have a theory that maybe whoever this news people went to go visit, there might be some town. It's possible there's some town in Italy that has this seven fish tradition. I've heard someone say that it's the thing in Shaka. I've never heard anyone from Shaka back this up. My theory is somebody from the New York newsroom went and interviewed a family buying fish for Christmas Eve, right? Especially when news media was so strong, you had all these roaming reporters. I'm sure they were someplace on Christmas Eve with an Italian family buying the fish, or they taped the Italian family cooking the fish or serving the fish. And they said, oh, we always have seven fishes on Christmas Eve. It's for good luck. And I think that's how the reporter decided to entitle the article or the news story, The Feast of the Seven Fishes.
Got it.
You weren't going to eat fresh fish in Italy.
Right.
Back
Bacala
150
maybe,
years ago.
but that's it.
Yeah, but bacala, if you go into the interior parts of Basilicata, Irpina, parts of Italy that are far from the ocean, yes, they would have bacala. Those are the two salted fishes. They would have bacala or anchovies on Christmas Eve. So they would have maybe, that was their big treat all year. Bacala was a very expensive thing. So they would soak their bacala. They might have it fried. They might have it in a salad, especially a salad with potatoes where it would be oil and lemon to make it stretch, go a little further. They might make zepolas, and they call it pizza frita, fried dough, different parts of the country. And they would put some bacala on that because you had to make it, you had to stretch it. You might have spaghetti with anchovies as the pasta course. You might have, I know people had spaghetti with bacala. You might make zeplas, again, the fried dough with anchovies in it. But that was the extent of the fish. I have found in the interior parts of Italy, and even in the coastal areas, the big thing 150 years ago, we'll say in the pre-war era, and even afterwards, was fried dough, some type of fried dough, because it was a special occasion, and a fried dough could feed a lot of people. So maybe you had spaghetti with anchovies, and then you had fried dough after with a little bit of bacala. Nobody in Irpinia in 1890 was making spaghetti and clams
Right.
or in Basilicata. It just didn't happen. I mean, it would take you a week to get the clams there
Right.
on a donkey. But after the war in Italy, all this stuff took off because now you had refrigerated cars, a refrigerated truck. So now all of a sudden, the same way people don't realize that after the war, so many people left the city of Naples and went to rural areas and opened up pastry shops because now with trucks and stuff, you can move things around. With gas ovens, you could regulate actually what you were baking. I mean, there was parts of interior Italy, rural places. They didn't see a birthday cake until after World War II.
Right.
That's when all this stuff started to happen. So I think, yes, after the war, with trucking and refrigeration, fresh fish was available all over Italy. So if you're living in Lucania, Basilicata in 1890, you can't have 7 fishes if your life depends on. But like every other American story, people came here. Stuff like my grandmother used to love to make, and we still do it, spaghetti with shrimp on Christmas Eve, right? I am sure that was not her mother's tradition. But where a lot of towns in Italy, the tradition was just like a simple aglio, spaghetti with garlic and oil, and maybe a little bit of anchovies. You come to America, now you have prosperity. Now you go out and you buy shrimp. Now you go out and buy lobster. For the Catholic Church, Christmas Eve was a day of fast and abstinence. So the Italians just took a fast and abstinence day and just brought it on to the next level. When I'm saying antiquity, I'm talking before the radio days. Vespers were a big thing. So if your parish church would have had Vespers on Christmas Eve, and then you would have had a midnight mass after that. And a lot of people, I mean, some people went to church for devotion, some people went to church to hear the music. So the idea of a fast day, a vigil, was much more pronounced for our ancestors. So I think there's a lot more with a vigil that we don't understand today because we have Charlie Brown Christmas. But I think which has really suffered is that all the fried food, like the zeppo, like the fried dough part of Christmas Eve has disappeared,
What's interesting
which is a
about
sign of
that
our
too is
prosperity.
is that then you look to the Jewish tradition, and of course it's the latkes and the oil. I mean, there's also something kind of universal in there, or at least tied deeply to the Mediterranean traditions, right? Of using oil to fry during this dark time of year and
Well,
making.
if you ask my mother her memories of Christmas Eve as a kid, it was because my grandmother was the Zapala fryer in the family. Because my grandmother's mother's side is Poundy Sorrento, and these Zapalas are really big in Sorrento. She would fry Zapalas, and they were covered with honey infused with anisette.
Mm,
And that's like if you ask my mother what her child like if you asked her what pops in your mind for Christmas Eve, it's my grandmother frying Zapals and running around to all the family and neighbors on the block.
right. No, I spoke with Anita Di Pietro, who's a chef in Irpinia, and she was talking about the minestra maritata and how it has to have 7 different types of herbs. And that sort of caught my attention. I asked her why 7, and she said, well, it was always the women that did the cooking, and there's a lot of folklore and there's a lot of tradition. There were all these traditions that were oral traditions. You also have in the
Oh yeah,
you
no,
also have
I'm
in the
not disagreeing with that.
Abruzzo, like, you've got the panarda where you have to have 40 dishes. What's that number come from? There are lots of traditions around really rural Italy that have a number attached to them
Oh
that
yeah,
doesn't
no, I'm
correspond to like the Bible. And I think those things come out of folklore and they change and transform, and it's almost impossible to really find like the Genesis story. But there's a lot of unspoken history that gets woven in. And so when Italians are like, "Oh, that doesn't non esiste in Italia," it's like, well, yeah, it kind of does.
Italians will adopt a practice and then say it always existed.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
They create. I know my friend Aaron. You're right about the numbers. My friend Aaron's where his mother's parents come from in Molise. I think they do for St. Joseph's Day, 12 different dishes or 13 different dishes, something like that. But my whole thing is like I like ricotta impera comes into ricotta impera. I think was in the 80s. Gets invented. Maybe it was the 90s, which is a
Tiramisu
big
is from the
deal.
60s. Yeah.
Tiramisu is from the 60s.
Penne alla
Then
vodka is from the 80s.
yeah, Delizia al Limone comes, and that's cool. It's
Yeah.
always great to have a new thing. But
Carbonara is
then
post-war.
I think we always made it, and then they start lecturing you
Yeah.
like Garibaldi arrived in Naples and had like a Delizia al Limone. He didn't,
No. No.
right? But no, at a cafe, yes, this is not true, and then
Yeah.
you get that. You get
Totally.
exhausted with that. But I think my money's on that this happened in, I would say about because I remember like watching like yesterday. I was watching TV. And then I'm talking about this 7 number. And I said to my grandmother, like, oh, 7 number. My grandmother was a superstitious person. My mother is too.
I mean, we always had fish. We always had a lot of different kinds of fish. My childhood memory is that of frying smelts, which I think most people would find disgusting, but I think is amazing.
Fish
And
smells good.
oh my gosh, I love fresh smelts, fresh out of the hot oil with salt on them, nothing better. But, we always had a lot of fish. And it wasn't until I mean, I think I was out of college where somebody else who was Italian American said to me, "You're going to have 7 fish?" And I was like, 7? I don't know how many. And I start counting. I'm like, well, we're gonna have the lobster tails, blah, 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 blah. I'm thinking, I think I just got to 5. And then she's like, it's not 7. That was the first
See, this is what
time.
happens with us.
The first time
Thank
I
you.
ever heard 7 fish. I mean, I think that was probably like in 2004 or 5.
It's
So
bullying. It's bullying.
yeah. All right. Well,
My
thank you
friend, I
very
got to
much for
run.
this. I
I will
appreciate
talk
it.
to you soon. It
Uh,
is such an honor. You are greatness, and I is an honor to be in the shadow of greatness.
Thank you. I hope you listen to some of the podcast episodes I put out because I got some good stuff in there that you'll appreciate.
All right, thanks. I'll
Thanks,
talk to you
Patrick.
later.
When I was teaching art history, I would use the phrase shadow ruin to describe a ritual or practice from religion or folklore that we can't trace to anything in particular. It's like a cultural hangover of something that existed but is now gone. Earlier this fall, when I sat down with Anita Di Pietro, who you met in episode 8, Irpinia's Magic Circle, she said that the minestra maritata had to be made with 7 different types of herbs. And that really caught my attention.
You usually need to have 7 kind of herbs. Yes, it's the tradition, yeah. Yes. And I think 7, sincerely, sometimes I found some relationship between the word of paganismo.
Paganism, yeah.
Yes, and 7 is an important number that usually come back 7 days of the week, 7, if I could remember, le 7 note della musica, ci sono. So I think that 7 is a special number for the simple people before the power of the church in a way. Yes, it's tradition, and sometimes this number come back in the old history of the woman, because in these last, I think, 20 years above all, the men win in the scene of the food, the restaurant, of the chef. And but in the past, the kitchen was a place for women.
Very appropriately, Mom is concerned that you're not eating anything, and so she wants to know if we want to take a little
Absolutely.
break and have a snack and then come back.
Perfect.
Okay.
Okay.
That snack turned out to be a full and fantastic lunch, as I'm sure you're not surprised. And at some point, I explained to Anita that I was stuck on the number 7 because of the Feast of the 7 Fishes. So many Italians on social media, they just love to criticize Italians of the diaspora, telling us that our adapted traditions are exaggerated or inauthentic. But as Anita said, the world of paganism is embedded in food. Farmers and foragers live in intimate contact with the earth and learn their lessons from nature. And it would be impossible to root them all out, pardon the metaphor, but people have always found comfort in patterns and solace in traditions. And ritual is a container to keep the ephemeral alive. And the Feast of the 7 Fishes is very much alive. Certainly here in the New York area, where people are waiting in line outside of fish markets, even with these terrible 20-degree temperatures we're having this week. I know people who are not Italian who are making fish this Christmas Eve. And that's the best thing that I could say about Italian culture. There is always more room for people at our table. Now, before we end, I'd like to share with you what my dear friend Jennifer Federico is making for Christmas Eve. She's from Pestum, Italy, and she's a newly minted American citizen. A couple of weeks ago, in fact, we celebrated her swearing in with Japanese ramen.
What my father had as a little kid growing up in Pestum. So I'm not 100% sure. For some reason, something that I never asked him. However, I'm sure there was some bacala involved. Bacala is a plate that is typical of southern Italy, even more in Campania. And my grandmother, my nonna Giannina, used to love it. So I'm sure there was a lot of bacala involved, and there are several recipes that are typical of this time, both Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve, that are baccalà fritto, so the fried and battered, then all'insalata in a salad, so boiled and then with lemon, salt, and different ways. Also, very typical one is insalata di rinforzo, so it's the baccalà with cauliflower and a pepper called papacelle, and is all mixed, a little bit spicy. All the men of the family love it. And then there is also il baccalà e patate, baccalà with the tomato sauce and potatoes, which actually just the other day I was saying to my mom we should do it, because growing up I didn't eat it that much because my father didn't like it, but my grandmother used to love it. So after that my grandmother passed away, we didn't eat it anymore. So I really would like to go back to that recipe. And I'm sure there was some anchovies involved, and escarole and broccoli. That's two or three typical things that are still very, very typical in my area. Anyway, growing up in the 80s, 90s in Pestum, the Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve was always, always, always seafood and fish, and Christmas Day and New Year's Day was meat. It was just like a religious thing that you have to do it that way. Since it was the 80s, there was a little bit of modernity involved. However, some plates, traditional plates, were always there, like the escarole, what's called la scarola imbuttunata, which is dialect for ripiena, means filled, and it's generally escarole with good slow cooked, filled with anchovies, olives, capers, pancetta, pepper, salt, and parsley, and wrap it up and slow cooked, and tons of seafood salad, and also la frittura mista. The frittura was also something typical, especially for us kids. It was like the moment, the high of the night. The frittura, the calamari, the gamberi, and all sorts of mixed tempura, let's say, style fried fish. Nowadays, what I do, I keep the tradition. I stick to the tradition a lot, especially since I moved to the United States. I think to keep the tradition alive and to feel close to my hometown, and to teach that to my son. So what always has to be there for me is the bacala, which is in the water right now in my house. And I do the escarole, and also something that I really like to do, it's the baby octopus alla Luciana. So it's baby octopus, slow cooked in tomato sauce. I add some capers and olives. Not everybody do it, but I love it that way. I keep the tradition really alive. I'm sure my plates are very similar to my nonna Giannina, with the recipes have been passed down from her to my father, my aunts, my mom, that she came from England and learned all those recipes the way had to be cooked. And then now to me.
This is the last episode of Tante Belle Cose for 2024, but I have so many beautiful things to share with you in 2025. If you're planning a trip to Italy, consider subscribing on Substack to become part of our trip planning community. For just $8 a month, you can ask me any question you want in the subscriber-only chat. And once a month, I host a session on Zoom where you can also ask me anything. And if you can't make it, don't worry. You can just email me the question, and I share the recording the day after. My goal for this podcast is to take you off the beaten path, to introduce you to the best people and places in Italy. And it's not only about practical travel advice. If you simply want to travel with your heart and mind, stay with us. All episodes are free and available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Substack. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Buona Vigilia, and thank you for listening. I'll see you next year.